Sunday morning, June 21st, 2026. Up on a mountainside above Lake Lucerne, in a Swiss resort called Bürgenstock, J.D. Vance is standing in a room with flags from 4 countries in the corner: the US, Iran, and the 2 mediators, Qatar and Pakistan. He's just told the Iranian delegation, in his own words, that the goal is to turn over a new leaf and fundamentally transform the relationship between Washington and Tehran. It's measured, it's hopeful, it's the kind of line you say when you want the other side to lower their guard. At almost the exact same moment, Donald Trump is on the phone with Fox News' Trey Yingst. And what comes out of that call is not measured at all. Trump tells Yingst he personally warned Iranian officials overnight that if they shut down the Strait of Hormuz, you won't have a country. He adds that they won't even make it back to their own country. He floats the idea that the US could simply seize the strait, run it themselves, and collect a cut of every barrel that passes through. He calls it being the guardian angel of the waterway. Same government, same morning. Same audience, more or less, because Iran's delegation was watching Fox News too. 2 completely different messages, broadcast at the same time, about the same deal. Every outlet covering this asked the same question afterward: will the talks survive the weekend? I think that's the wrong question to spend your time on. The real story is what it means that the United States can no longer keep its threats and its diplomacy on separate channels, and what it tells you that Iran's response wasn't fear. It was something closer to boredom. Here's what I want to walk through. First, what was actually said this weekend, because the exact wording matters more than the summary. Second, a reversal Trump made days earlier that barely got covered, and the much sharper contradiction sitting underneath it that almost nobody noticed, including something his own vice president said just 3 days before the Bürgenstock meeting. And third, why the way Iran's chief negotiator responded to the threat is more revealing than the threat itself. And like always, this is my read on it. I'll give you the strongest version of the opposite case too, because you should get to weigh both. Before the evidence, here's the lens I want you to use. Threats work in negotiation, but only under one condition. The other side has to believe 2 things: that you'll actually follow through, and that following through costs you less than backing down does. Take away either one of those, and a threat stops being leverage. It becomes noise. Economists who study bargaining call this a credibility problem, and it's the single most useful idea for understanding what happened in Switzerland this weekend. Keep that in your back pocket. We're going to test it against what actually happened. On Saturday, Iran's Joint Military Command announced, again, that it was closing the Strait of Hormuz, this time citing Israeli strikes in Lebanon that Tehran says violate the ceasefire framework everyone signed onto in Versailles less than a week earlier. American officials disputed that the strait was actually closed, saying tanker traffic was continuing. Oil markets, for what it's worth, had already been sliding for days, down from the highs they hit earlier in the war. That's the backdrop for Trump's call to Yingst. Beyond "you won't have a country," he told Yingst that if Iran's president kept talking about enrichment rights, Iran had better watch their mouth and better shape up, or will take over the rest of the country. He also said the memorandum of understanding he signed days earlier was, in his words, just an option, and that once it expires, I can do whatever I want. Now here's why the timing matters beyond the optics. The memorandum's very first clause commits both countries to refrain from threatening force against each other, not just using force, threatening it. That language exists in agreements like this specifically because a threat of annihilation is its own form of coercion. It poisons the well for everything negotiated under it. Trump's call wasn't just undiplomatic. Depending on how you read Clause 1, it arguably violated the agreement he'd signed 4 days earlier, while his own vice president was sitting across the table from the people being threatened. Trita Parsi, who runs the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, has been blunt about how fragile this moment is, describing the kind of escalation we saw this weekend as a genuine threat to the entire peace process. Not background noise, but something that could unravel it. Here's the part that should have been a bigger story on its own. For most of this war, the Trump administration's position was absolute, zero enrichment. Steve Witkoff, Trump's envoy, said publicly the US wouldn't accept Iran retaining even 1% enrichment capability. J.D. Vance himself, on June 18th, 3 days before Bergenstock, drew a sharp line against the old Obama-era nuclear deal, saying flatly that where that agreement allowed Iranian enrichment, ours will not. Then, at the G7 summit, Trump was asked whether Iran could keep a civilian nuclear program for electricity. His answer, "You have to use a little common sense." He went further, saying it's tough to tell Iran it can't have something for power generation when neighboring states have it. That is, in plain terms, a door left open to exactly the kind of enrichment his own VP had ruled out days before. So within a single week, you have the vice president publicly rejecting enrichment, the president publicly leaving room for it, and then, after Iran's president seized on Trump's comment to say Tehran's right to enrich was non-negotiable and that Washington would be forced to accept it, Trump responding not with clarification, but with a midnight threat to erase the country. That sequence matters. According to multiple reports from the talks, Trump's outburst wasn't a response to any new Iranian military action. CENTCOM had already said the strait was still moving traffic. It was a response to how Iran's president was narrating Trump's own concession as a win for Tehran rather than a gift from Washington. That's not a reaction to a threat, that's a reaction to a headline. After Trump's comments aired, Iran's delegation filed a formal protest with the Qatari and Pakistani mediators and left the venue. Iranian state media called it a difficult, insulting moment. But the man who runs the show on disagreements, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, Speaker of Iran's parliament and the senior figure in the room, didn't sound rattled when he addressed it publicly. He said his delegation simply doesn't take American threats seriously. Then he asked the question that I think tells you the most. Don't they think that if their threats had worked, they wouldn't have ended up in today's desperate situation? That's not defiance for the cameras. That's an argument from a track record. Trump has threatened at various points to wipe out Iran's whole civilization and to blow up the country. None of it stopped Iran from reclosing the strait, from holding its ground on enrichment, or from walking away from the table when it wanted to. Ghalibaf followed up by saying the US had better be more careful with their statements, that Iran's armed forces were ready to respond in a different way, and, pointedly, no matter what they say, we are the ones who act. It's also worth knowing who Ghalibaf is. He's not a career diplomat, he's a former IRGC commander and one of the most powerful hardline figures in Iranian politics. Sending him to a negotiation like this is a signal in itself. Tehran wants the military establishment's fingerprints on the outcome, so hardliners back home can't later claim the diplomats sold them out. And yet, this is the part that complicates a simple talks collapsing narrative. The day didn't actually end in collapse. Qatar and Pakistan, the mediators, described the overall session as happening in a positive and constructive atmosphere. Iran's foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, posted that the meeting delivered major progress, citing movement on oil exports, frozen assets, and reconstruction. The two sides reportedly agreed on a roadmap to keep working toward a final deal inside the 60-day window. Iran walked out of the room and stayed in the process at the same time. So let me make the strongest case against everything I just said, because it's a real one. Trump's threat-heavy approach has, by any honest measure, produced more movement with Iran than years of careful conventional diplomacy under prior administrations. Threats to obliterate the country were followed, weeks later, by Iran showing up in Islamabad, then Geneva, then signing on to the Versailles framework. The pattern this weekend looks identical. Escalate, watch Iran storm out for the cameras, and watch the real conversation continue quietly through the mediators anyway, which is exactly what happened. Maybe the walkout was domestic theatre for Tehran's hardliners, and the actual deal-making never stopped. I think that's a serious argument. But three things make this instance different from the pattern. One, this threat came after the deal was signed, not before it. Every prior threat was aimed at getting Iran to the table. This one landed 4 days after Iran was already at the table, implementing the thing it had agreed to. That's not pressure to negotiate, that's a potential breach of what was already negotiated. And now Iran has the text of Trump's own memorandum to point to the next time it wants to slow walk something. 2. The enrichment reversal pulled the floor out from under the threat's logic. Give up your nuclear program or face destruction is brutal, but it's coherent. You can keep a civilian nuclear program, and also, we might erase your country, is not a demand Iran can comply with to make the threat go away. A threat with no available compliance isn't leverage, it's just noise, which is exactly the credibility problem I flagged at the start. 3. Ghalibaf's answer wasn't emotional, it was a citation of facts. Iran's enriched stockpile is still there. The strait is still functionally contestable. None of Trump's previous maximum threats produced a durable outcome Washington wanted. A negotiating partner who responds to a threat with an accurate scorecard isn't panicking. They're telling you they've already run the numbers. So here's where I'd point your attention over the next stretch of this 60-day window, because these are things you can actually check. Watch whether Washington takes any concrete action tied to the strait closure claim, or whether it stays purely rhetorical. CENTCOM already disputed that the strait was meaningfully shut. If nothing operational follows the threat, that tells Iran the threats are for domestic and media consumption, not enforcement. Watch the language of whatever comes out of the next round of talks. Specifically, does anyone define what actually counts as a violation of the ceasefire, and who gets to make that call? Right now, Iran says the strait is closed, and the US says it isn't, and that ambiguity is exactly what let this whole blow-up happen. If the next document doesn't fix that, expect this same fight again in a few weeks. Watch whether Trump's opening towards civilian enrichment survives contact with his own party. Hardline senators have pushed back hard on any softening toward Iran. If that common sense comment quietly disappears under pressure, Iran will read it as proof the concession was never real, and that will make every future Trump concession harder to trust. And watch Ghalibaf's attendance, not his statements. He's the IRGC's political presence in that room. As long as he keeps showing up after being personally threatened, that tells you Iran needs what this deal unlocks: sanctions relief, frozen assets, badly enough to swallow the insult. If he stops showing up, or gets replaced by someone more hardline, that's the real signal the process is in trouble. So here's where that leaves us. One government sent 2 messages to the same room on the same morning, one offering a new chapter, one threatening to end the other side's existence. And the threat may have technically broken the very deal it was meant to enforce. It wasn't triggered by anything new Iran did militarily. It was triggered by Iran's president describing Trump's own concession in a way Trump didn't like. And Iran's answer wasn't fear. It was a complaint filed using America's own paperwork, a walkout staged for a domestic audience, and a one-line argument from a former IRGC commander that boiled down to, "We've heard this before, and it didn't work then either." 60 days are now running on a clock that decides whether this turns into a real, lasting deal or a return to a war that Trump himself has said would be an economic catastrophe to restart. The midnight threat didn't move Iran an inch. What it did was hand them a credible grievance, for free, 4 days into the agreement. And that leaves one question worth sitting with. When the same government hands you both an open hand and a closed fist in the same hour, which one are you supposed to believe is the actual policy? I'll see you in the next one.